All right, my good friends, this is Mr. Davis. I'm just going to briefly go over the notes that you have done so far, and then I'm going to play a pretty powerful documentary about the Holocaust. Even with this remote education and things we're skipping, we're skipping quite a bit here. I'm going to try in this last week to uh, talk about. The bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, talk about a little bit, just touch on the Cold War and after, but we can't skip over the Holocaust. So this is going on by the Nazis, of course. Adolf Hitler is persecuting the Jews. They're also persecuting homosexuals. Gypsies is another group of people. So there's a lot of people that the Nazis are going after. Now, Adolf Hitler wasn't the worst guy. Well, I should take that back. He probably was the worst guy, but there was another really bad guy we've been talking about, Joseph Stalin, who also is going to be executing some of his own people and working his own people to death in an area of the Soviet Union called Siberia. So that, unfortunately, with how the classes worked, with getting an extra week of basically an extra week and a half of spring break, and then losing a couple weeks on the end, which I'm not complaining about. I'm just saying we're losing a lot of time. So you graduate World Civ, and we might not have touched on some of the real necessities we would every year. But just how it is, this is a pandemic, so we have to be flexible. I hope you have a great summer, rejuvenated, and ready to get after it when we get back to school. So we're going to talk a little bit about the Holocaust. Now, you should have been finishing up your notes on the Holocaust. So what did we discover about World War II? We know the course of the war. We know that Adolf Hitler rallied the Germans because the Germans were persecuted at the Treaty of Versailles. They had to pay everybody back these war debts. Just really, tore the German mentality down. They also could no longer have an army. That's another thing that kind of makes you feel like a weak nation if you can't have an army. They were able to have some forces that could defend their nation in case they were attacked, but they weren't allowed to have an offensive army. So a variety of reasons that goes on that Germany is feeling persecuted again. So Adolf Hitler thrives on that persecution. He gets the people riled up, and his main objective is to get them mad to exterminate the Jews. Okay, the horrible history of the Holocaust. We know the first beginning years of the war, Adolf Hitler is taking care of business. He didn't get to this powerful of a man as he was, even though he's horrible, evil monster. He didn't get there because he was an idiot or not a military genius. He had a lot of cunning abilities on what to do at the right time. He makes a lot of gambles in the beginning of the wars, and even prior to the first invasion of Poland, that pay off. Like for example, he started taking back German territory around the country that was taken away from them at the Treaty of Versailles, and he called the rest of the world's bluff, and they gave in to him. And remember, that was the appeasement process, and they appeased him by giving him his territory back. So he was doing some successful things for Germany. 1942 is kind of like, if you think of World War II as a mountain, see where my cursor is here, and where the M, that's like the height for the Germans. This is like 1942. And then everything after 1942, it's in like 1945, goes downhill very quickly after 1942. Here was another evil monster. He was kind of in charge of this German resettlement program, which you learn about in your notes. Basically, what he's saying is that we're going to have this master Aryan race, and we need a place for them to live, and we're going to have to provide food for them. So we're going to conquer these other nations. We're going to get rid of all the people that are already living there, and we are going to use those nations to grow us food, to house and feed this great German Reich, this German Empire. His first attempt was Poland. 2 million ethnic Germans were moved into Poland after they conquered it. And that's kind of a really interesting little fact there. They actually was taking time to move people into Poland, which would be out here, right here is Poland. The invasion, so this is where Adolf Hitler makes probably his biggest mistake of the war. if you remember from our notes, the Germans had a non-aggression pact. And what a non-aggression pact meant with the Soviets was that you don't attack me, I won't attack you. If you get in a fight, we're staying out of it. If I get in a fight, you stay out of it. But just like every deal Hitler had made, he never made deals in order to keep the deal. He only made deals, and you know this about sometimes they call this narcissistic people, psychopath people. They're only worried about themselves. I'm not saying you know people like Adolf Hitler, but you do know people sometimes that are always looking out for number one. And any deal that Hitler would have made, he would be looking out for number one. So he made a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union, not because he respected Stalin, he supported what Stalin was doing. He made that pact so that he could do other things before attacking Stalin. That gave him a head start, so that while he's attacking Poland and when he is going to be starting to send troops towards France, he doesn't have to worry about Stalin because they had made a non-aggression pact. Now, ultimately, it was, of course, his main objective is that he is going to attack the Soviet Union. But other than, wait for it, the Mongols, nobody really successfully attacks the Soviet Union. So what his plan was is that a social engineering project where people in Russia would become slaves to the Germans. That's pretty wild because they had such a huge population out there in Russia that they were just going to turn them into slaves. This is one of that, this jerk was one of his quotes from one of his speeches. He's telling a group of people, whether nations live in prosperity or starve to death interests me only insofar as we need them as slaves for our culture. Otherwise, it is of no interest. Basically saying, I don't care what happens to any non-Germans, to any Jews, any people outside Germany. If they starve to death, I don't care. I'm only caring about the benefit of the Nazis. So the Holocaust here. So these are eerie, creepy pictures. Now, there are some idiots out in the world, and I don't like to just throw the word around idiots, but I've heard people say, the Holocaust was not real, or it was made up, or it's propaganda. And those people, if they do say that, they are an idiot in terms of their knowledge about the Holocaust. The Holocaust was definitely real. The commander, the D-Day commander, turned a president. He becomes a president from 1952 to 1960, and I'll call on my good friend Bentley if she knows who this D-Day commander was. The president? Yes, you are correct, Bentley. It was Dwight D. Eisenhower. So why am I talking about Eisenhower? It's because when Eisenhower, had his troops storm the beaches in Omaha and Juneau and in Normandy, France, and they start liberating France, and then they eventually make their way to the concentration camps here. When France is right here, when they start liberating these concentration and these death camps, a lot of the people told Eisenhower, we cannot film this. Like, people cannot see what's going on. And he said, no, we must film it. We cannot hide this from the rest of the world because, in turn, we allow this to happen. People need to see what true evil is, and it doesn't matter if we're showing them a huge mass grave of tens of thousands of Jews that are thrown naked into a grave. It doesn't matter. We need to show the rest of the world. So if people ever say, Holocaust is made up, etc., and I don't think it's a common, viewpoint, but I have heard people say that before, and it's really stupid. And that's why, and also I've seen, and even at Brossard and the school, as you see, people have drawn a swastika somewhere, and if you do that, that's pretty stupid. And I've unfortunately, you've seen it throughout all the schools I've been to in my career. I've seen it a time or two, and it's really ignorant, whether it's NKU or subbing it. Around 20 schools I've subbed at, occasionally I've seen it, and it's pretty disgusting when you see that. But so here are the boys in their striped pajamas, shaved head, to dehumanize them. So before they got to the concentration camps, they were you're rounded up into ghettos, and the ghetto, basically what they did is the Nazis fenced off neighborhoods, and rounded Jews up into these fenced off neighborhoods. And this is prior to them being shipped off to the concentration camps or trained off to the concentration camps. In Poland, they put up all the Polish Jews. They put them in ghettos. The conditions were horrible. Families were crowded together in unsanitary conditions. Nazis tried to starve the residents by only allowing a minimum amount of food. Now, one thing we will maybe touch on a little bit, but it's really sad that we're going to miss this, is the Diary of Anne Frank. And she would have been hiding out in one of these ghettos. So the death squads, the SS followed the regular army's advance into the Soviet Union. Their job was to round up Jews, execute them, and put them in mass graves. Graves were massive pits, often dug by victims who themselves would be, just pushed into the grave themselves before they were shot. So horrible. This is, now in psychology, when I taught psychology, it's really interesting to look at the psychology of the Nazi guards. And because right after Dwight Eisenhower brings this footage back to the Americas, the whole rest of the world is kind of like, I don't know, hopefully you've never had a really bad situation where you knew you should have spoke up and did something, stopped the situation from happening, but you took the easy way out and you didn't prevent a really bad thing from happening. So hopefully you've never been in that situation. But the rest of the world kind of feels like they knew this was going on and they just did not want to start World War III. So it was like kind of like the rest of the world is feeling guilty. So when this images are shot, the world is kind of like, how did we get to this point in history? Like, how did we get to these evil men in this nation following a guy like Adolf Hitler who wants to wipe out a whole segment of the population just because of their religious beliefs? And people studied it, and they studied the Nazi guards, and they said, how could a guard execute in their lifetime thousands of people if you were at Auschwitz? Like, how could you lock the door on a gas chamber? If you've ever seen, I don't know, a spoiler alert, if you've ever seen Boy in the Striped Pajamas, it's a very rough ending to the movie on how these two little boys are locked into a gas chamber. How could you be the one that locked that door? Like, what would be going through your mind? A lot of people theorize that these people were psychopaths. They were psychotic. They were deranged, insane. And there's a really good, and the people always thought this was interesting. They've done different types of experiments, obviously not with a life and death type of scenario, but they did experiments and they showed what people would do if they just followed orders. And what psychologists have proven about the Nazi guards, now not all of them, of course, but for the most part, psychologists have theorized that the Nazi guards believed that they were just following orders and they had to do it. And they actually were doing the right thing by doing these horrible, horrible tasks. Now, I don't know. I would like to think if I was put in that situation, heck no, I would never do anything like that the Nazi guards would have done to these people. But what psychologists have said is, when you're put into a group mentality, mob mentality, and you are following orders, you will follow orders blindly because you're being told so. Now, again, I would like to think that I would never, ever do something like that. You always look back and say, I would always be on the right side of history. Because they simply said not all these people really could be psychopath maniacs. But that is by no means me defending any of these Nazi guards. I'm just saying that psychologists have studied the concentration camps after that, and that's kind of what they said, is that they were following orders. But that being said, Nazi guards still to this day are being tracked down and they're being put on trial, and some of them are like in their 90s, 100 years old. And really, they'd be pretty close to 100 years old. So they're still being tracked down in the world. And occasionally, every now and again, you might see a Nazi guard living in the United States who escaped World War II and was never punished until they're like 90 years old. Pretty scary. Now, we're going to look at the death camp Auschwitz, and this is a pretty interesting documentary. It's rough. It's a rough watch. The reason I like it is because it's two girls that are your guys' age, like 15 and 16. I think they'll tell you what country they're from, but they're speaking English. So I think maybe they're from England. I'm not positive, but we're gonna follow this survivor, and she was around your guys' age when she was in Auschwitz, and she survived. This is a train leading into Auschwitz. Now, why I think it's so important to talk about the Holocaust is you should know this, and just put this into perspective. Your train is coming into Auschwitz. You're told to get off the train. On this side, women and girls are going. On this side, men and boys are going. Now think about that. Think about your family. Say you have, I grew up with a sister. When we get off the train, my dad and I go to this side. My sister and mom go to that side. We never see them again. Okay? Chances are you're never going to lay eyes on them again. They segregated the men and the women, and some. And think about this for a second. As soon as you got off the train, the decision was being made whether you were going to die immediately or you're going to be put to work. So this is, along with slavery, this is one of the hardest things I can think of that we have to talk about in history. Thinking about like a little boy being ripped away from his mom, when he's like 6 years old. I can't fathom. My mind just kind of stops working when I think about that. I try, it just blocks out how sad it is. But we're going to pick it up. There's going to be some questions that go along with it. So let me get started here. I'm going to pause this for 1 second. Okay, so here is the beginning of this documentary. It's very powerful. There are some inappropriate remarks in here, nothing too bad, but this is a really, really powerful documentary that will begin here.
Auschwitz, the Nazi death camp where more than 1 million people, mainly Jews, were murdered. People with families and friends. Ordinary people robbed of their future. Each had their own unique story of how they came to be at Auschwitz. Only a minority survived. And today, decades later, very few can explain what happened there as witness to its human terror. Kitty Hart Mogson was 17 years old when she arrived at Auschwitz-Birkenau in April 1943. Now she travels back one last time to answer the questions of a new generation.
My name is Kitty Hart Mogson, and I'm a Holocaust survivor.
Designed as a factory of death, no one was intended to survive, let alone describe its inhumanity to a world not yet ready to listen.
No one wanted to know. No one wanted to hear what I had to say. But I made a commitment that the people don't want to hear, but I'm going to make sure that they will. I've been here many times, but I really wanted to come with two girls who were my age when I was here. I want to show them the struggle for survival.
What were your first impressions of the camp?
There was just the most incredible mud. And then we saw like a glow in the distance. And soon when we got there, we saw ghost-like figures with shaved heads, staggering in tattered clothes, with great big eyes, screaming in all languages and being beaten. And we thought, my God, this was going to happen to us.
I've known Kitty since I was born. I've known about her story since I was little and sort of grown up with the influence of it. What did you first see when you got off the train?
Alsatian dogs. They were barking, trying to get at us.
And I wanted to try and understand a bit better how she coped in these conditions and how she managed to survive for so long.
And we're walking into the women's camp now.
I met Kitty for the first time after the school talk she gave us, and I went up and asked some questions to her. And I'm just kind of nervous and excited because I want to see it from a different perspective that I may have seen it in class.
And you see these stumps? These are the chimneys of the wooden barracks.
What happens to you when you're in those formative years, age 13 to 16? It shapes you and your character for the whole of your life. Auschwitz is where my grandma feels she belongs, and it always calls her back.
Kitty Hart was one of the first survivors to tell her story. She gives us access to that experience with the power of her words. You have to treat what Kitty says almost like music. I hear what she says, and I also try to listen to what she has left unsaid.
You see this crossroad? The crossroad was the crossroad to life or death.
The very fact that Kitty was an eyewitness and can say, this is what I saw, actually ensures that it cannot be denied, that the intentionality of the perpetrators is clear, and that it's indisputable that what she saw is what happened.
And as you walked, you got stuck in this mud, and all these people were falling around in the mud.
You cannot stand there and simply say, this is okay. This should never have happened. It should never have existed. And as a human being, thinking about the experience of others, you just realize this is no place for anybody to have ever been.
Just prior to invasion, my father decided we've got to get out. My brother fled with his friends to the Russian side. They were asked to join the army, the Polish army, within a Russian unit, and eventually was killed in the Battle of Stalingrad. So my father, my mother, and my grandmother, we got on the last train. The train just took us to Lublin, and that's where everyone was thrown out, and that's where we landed up. And we were taken to a part of the town which became the Lublin ghetto.
It wasn't possible to survive in Poland as a Jewish person without relying on somebody else. So Kitty's mother, in a time of crisis, what does she do? She starts teaching English to people. In doing that, she creates a relationship with the priest.
The priest told my mother, if you come to a point where there's no way out, just come and I'll see what I can do.
The priest then is able to help and puts his life on the line to provide them documents to get them out.
We had to part from my father. The priest said no way could we survive, all three of us together. My father was to go and work in this sawmill somewhere we didn't know where, and my mother and I, we were to go into the center of Lublin. Why? Because they were rounding up the Polish population as well. And when they sorted them out, they took them to work in factories in Germany. And the priest said, that's what we've got to do. We've got to get out of the country and mix with this transport and get into Germany. And they actually checked documents, but our documents were in order, you see. And before my mother and I collected our thoughts, we were in a train and landed up far, far inside Germany.
It was very difficult for Jews to be able to hide within the Polish population because just small cultural and linguistic things such as accents could creep in and change the perception of you as being truly a Polish citizen.
Well, what happened was, because they suspected us, one of them reported us to the authorities. And that was our downfall.
Kitty was arrested for illegal entry into Germany as Leokadia Dobczynska and sent for interrogation. The Nazis wanted to know the source of their false documents.
The irony of the Nazis was they could create death camps and murder Jews with impunity, but if somebody broke a law, they had to go through the penal system, which was complete nonsense because they could have simply deported them to Auschwitz as Jews. But because the legal system didn't allow it, they eventually were deported to Auschwitz with a death penalty for immigration charges.
So we were told we were going to be executed by firing squad. It was a brick wall, and we had to face the wall with our arms up like that, standing facing the wall. And then there was a huge explosion. And I thought, God, I haven't been hit. There was a great laughter. They said, oh no, we're not going to kill you. What's going to happen? We're going to commute your death sentence to life imprisonment in Auschwitz, and we're going to hand you over to the camp. They'll find out where these documents came from. So we were in a train that was specially converted to transport prisoners. And we traveled 48 hours standing before we arrived in Auschwitz. Well, we had absolutely no idea where we were. It was dark.
What did you first see when you got off the train?
Well, the thing opened up and you heard an awful lot of noise.
Were you scared?
Well, we were scared of the dogs,
Yeah.
and then the great big women with whips, and they were whipping everyone and urging everyone to run, everything at a running pace. Suddenly, there was a weird kind of stench, and the closer we got, the worse the stench became. And my mother said, what a curious place there. Can you smell? Can you smell roasting meat? I said, yes, I can. She said, do you think they're roasting chickens here this time of the night? I said, I don't know.
Kitty and her mother were sent to Birkenau, the largest of the 44 camps in the Auschwitz system, where they were processed and sent to quarantine.
When did you first stay in a wooden barrack?
Well, this was the quarantine. Okay, so the first night we were pushed into here.
Did you find somewhere to sleep?
Well, we squeezed in somewhere here. I was incredibly cold that night because we were 48 hours without food, and I slept all night next to a woman. And she started speaking to me in German. It turned out she was a German gypsy.
Right.
During the early morning, while she was talking to me, she looked at my hand. She took my hand. She said, give me your hand. And she said, you know, you're going to come out. And the next thing that happened, whistles blew suddenly. It was still dark. And everybody was saying, rouse, out. And because this was quarantine, we didn't know.
Yeah.
And I shook this woman, you know.
Yeah.
And she didn't move. And I said to my mother, she's cold, she's dead. And I said, you know, you're cold, I'm cold. We need to strip her. And we need to have everything she's got.
Yeah.
Surviving Auschwitz was virtually impossible. And there was certainly no way you can say, if you did this, then this would happen. It was a matter of luck and chance and being in the right place at the right time. But there were some circumstances and some strategies that kind of worked.
That came to me that night, that actually that's the way to do it. That if you do have the people that have died, you've got to take everything off them. Because it's not good to them, was it?
You had to do what you needed to do to survive, and if that was taken from the dead, that's what it meant.
Not in the history of mankind has there been industrial killing on this scale. If something happened once, there's absolutely no reason why it can't happen again.
In 1943, Kitty was assigned to work on a new rail line into Birkenau called the Ramp. In 1944, she watched as transports of Jews from Hungary started to arrive.
What was the importance of the ramp?
People arrived in cattle trucks, and sometimes 7 or 10 trains would arrive in saying 24 hours, and people were sealed in, almost airtight, just a little bit of air coming through the slats. Sometimes the trains were sealed here for hours before they were allowed to unload.
Did people die in the trains?
Yeah, a lot of people died before they arrived here. Some people traveled 7 days before they arrived here.
Did anyone have any idea what was happening when they got off the train?
People had not the foggiest idea what was going to happen. Of course, there were people coming from the ghettos, so they didn't expect anything, you know, good, obviously. Everything was very nice and quiet because they didn't want people to panic. So loudspeakers were here telling people, well, there's a lot of typhus here, and so you're all going to be disinfected, and we've got to split. We went from women and women with children. Leave your luggage, you're going to get your luggage later. And then someone came, right, left, men this way, women with children on one side. Younger people are younger. You can go that way. Oh, you're older. You take your child with you and be fine. You take your child. We're not going to split you up.
It was shocking to see that you stood in the exact same place as those people did once.
At the ramp, women with children and the elderly were sent directly to their death. And if you were young and able-bodied, and if at that period of time they needed workers, then you were chosen for slave labor, which essentially meant that you were chosen to die slowly, not to die immediately in the gas chambers.
Let me tell you, at this point, families were split. Never, ever saw one another again. So, some of the men were taken this way. Okay. Some of the girls that were selected to go into the camp were taken through there. You were just told to go that way. And you know the road there. Where does that go?
The gas chambers.
That's it.
What happened when you arrived at camp?
Well, we were taken to a building like this, which we didn't know what it was, but it was called the sauna. Not like you and I understand it, a processing place. And the first thing that happened to you, you were stripped, everything was taken from you, you were smeared with a green fluid, your hair was shaved everywhere.
That was then packaged and shipped off for processing. Hair was used both to create cloth and to line submarines and as detonators.
And then you were tattooed, and believe you me, that was when you felt you were no longer the same person.
When that tattoo was placed on your arm, you weren't what your parents had given you as your name, you became that number, and that was your identification completely taken away.
Not only is it a disgusting thing to do to human beings, but that's my grandma, and they wanted to turn her into an animal.
Without your hair and without your clothing, you lose something very distinctive about you. And there are people who remember at that point that they looked ridiculous.
It was hard to imagine how she survived. Every corner she turned, there was something trying to stop her from living.
First of all, survival depended on the place of work. If you were working outside, and the commandos, which are work parties, you hadn't had a prayer to survive for long. The other thing you couldn't survive was without a pair of shoes. Well, the problem was that you were issued wooden clogs. Your clogs would get stuck in the mud. Your feet would rub. They would get infected. And you were dead. If you didn't have your bowl, you were dead because nobody would give you their bowl. So survival depended on if you could not think about anything, just have a tunnel vision and think like an animal. Just picture yourself, what does an animal do? What does an animal need? Well, it doesn't need very much just to live, but the first thing it needs to get away from the predators, get away from all these people that are trying to kill you.
There were capos who were prison foremen, and they became more cruel than the German masters themselves.
Well, how do you get away from these people? Any of the ruling princes could come up to you and kill you.
And consequently, you couldn't figure out a strategy for survival. At Auschwitz, there was no why. It was done by whim.
Did you know that the wooden sheds were actually meant for 52 horses? And so they put these bunk things up there.
There were 1,000 people in there.
And 1,000 people inside. That's right.
What happened the first thing in the morning when you woke up?
You were woken up with the sound of whistles, roughly around about 4 in the morning. So roll calls took place twice a day, and roll calls was one of the greatest terrors of the camp. Whistles blew, and everybody, there were screams, out, 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 schnell, raus, raus. Total chaos. 1,000 people had to rush out of this door. And you see the ground, you're looking at grass, but you must look at mud. The whole thing was just one sea of mud. I've always said, if you found a blade of grass, what would you do with it? You'd eat it. So people were just staggering around the mud. But of course you had to stand to attention.
Selection didn't just take place on arrival at Auschwitz, it was a daily occurrence. In fact, any time that prisoners were together, if anybody at any point in time tipped over into that place where they were no longer useful to the Nazis, they could simply be selected and sent into the gas chamber.
People just collapsed and died. Died of tiredness, of exhaustion, of shock.
Did you ever have to collect the corpses after roll call?
Yes. Oh, yes. When I was in the Leichenkommando, this is what we did. Well, I don't know if people realize, but when you are hungry, hunger is a total obsession. You're just thinking, hunger, I must have something to eat. I must. If I don't eat something, I'll die.
It depended where you were in line as to how much nutrition you got. If you were at the beginning of the line, you got pure water. If you were at the end of the line, you had a problem because they might run out of food. And if you knew the person who was ladling out the food, then in one sense they dug deep and they got the stuff in the soup that landed at the bottom, whether it's a potato or a carrot or something.
Hunger is the worst thing that anybody can experience, I think.
Did you stay in a bunk like this then?
If you were lucky, there was one straw mattress and one blanket for 8 people. How did 8 people sleep here?
Like sardines next to each other.
That's it, you got it.
Yeah.
Head to feet, so you had somebody's feet in your face.
Yeah. Did people die in the night then? Did you have any
Yes,
experience
people
with
died
that?
in the night, that's right.
If somebody died next to you, all of a sudden you found your own body heat going out. You needed the warmth of the other body in order.
Okay, that is where we will stop with this documentary today. So you just need to make sure the accompanying questions are filled out and submitted. So the 2 things you need to do is watch this Ed puzzle. This just ensures that you watch the lesson. And then the second thing you need to do is turn in the homework. So Ed puzzle needs to be finished, and the homework questions that go along with this video need to be finished as well. And that is where we will stop. So almost there, boys and girls, almost there. So give me a second.